Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this presentation on NFTs and the future of digital art. My name is Tina Rivers Ryan, and I am an assistant curator at the Albright-Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York. And I am going to be spending the next 45 minutes talking about the history of digital art, which I believe you need to know in order to understand where it might be headed in the future, and also talking about NFTs and what NFTs mean for the future of digital art. So it's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. It's going to be a bit of a whirlwind. I hope that you guys have questions. Please go ahead and drop them into the chat box, into the Q&A box, and I will address them at the end of the presentation. On February 19th of this year, this meme, which is a very popular image that has been circulating on the internet for over a decade, known as Nyan Cat, was auctioned for $772,000. And I will never forget that day, because when I saw that news, the news of this auction come across my news feed, I knew that instantly the landscape for digital art had changed. We were suddenly talking about the emergence of a market for digital assets, for digital collectibles, for memes, for JPEG files that was emerging essentially overnight. So in short order, this gave rise to the NFT explosion this year. And I don't want to get into the technicalities of exactly what an NFT is or what the blockchain is, or we will never get through the material this evening. But suffice it to say that essentially, on a technical level, the reason this is happening right now is because about a decade ago, we saw the emergence of a new technology called blockchain. And blockchain is a way of keeping digital records distributed across a network of computers that are all using cryptography in order to sort of verify information in blocks that are stored and in a way that's supposed to be immutable and completely secure, and also can be anonymous. So none of that really matters for the conversation around art. I will just say this evening is that the blockchain allows you to create a digital record of a transaction that is public and supposedly, again, immutable or secure, and is not something that can be duplicated. In other words, it's not fungible. Fungible meaning exchangeable. Like, if I have $1 and you have $1 and we swap them, we both wind up with $1. They're sort of exchangeable. But digital records, normally are infinitely reproducible. And what the NFT does is it's essentially a token or a record on the blockchain that is totally unique, that cannot be replicated, that cannot be copied, and therefore can act as a kind of surrogate for a digital asset that is inherently reproducible, like a JPEG file or a piece of code, a URL, et cetera. So non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, you can just think of them as sort of like receipts that are used in order to transfer either symbolic or, in fewer cases, legal ownership over an associated digital asset. And we have seen that with these, the sort of emergence of NFTs as a way of buying and selling digital art, there has been a sort of a new parallel art market and art world that has come into its own this year. And so the artists who originally were sort of propelled forward by this whole new market were not really artists who were shown or exhibited in either the traditional quote unquote mainstream contemporary art world or the digital art community, which I'll talk more about later. So they're what we might call like crypto native or NFT native artists. They're artists who really came to prominence because of NFTs. So in order to understand what happened this year, sort of like a year in review, I will take a step back and again talk about what digital art is first, and what digital art, sort of the history of digital art in 15 minutes or less, and then talk a little bit more about where NFTs came from and sort of what I see as the history of blockchain and art, which actually does have a history that predates just this year. And we're very pleased to be presenting this information to you here at the Albright-Knox. For those of you who aren't aware of our institutional history, we have a long history of supporting artists who are working with emerging technologies. So for example, in 1910, we had what was likely the very first American exhibition in a museum of photography as a fine art. And that was curated by Alfred Stieglitz, and it was called the International Exhibition of Pictorial Photography. And we also, have carried that legacy forward. More recently, in the 1990s, we curated an early survey of video art, specifically video art projection called Being in Time. So, we have always supported emerging artists, and that means that also supporting artists who are working with emerging technologies. So this is very much in our DNA. And actually right now, if you come to Buffalo, if you're in Buffalo and come visit the museum, we have on view in our satellite space that we're operating during the expansion of our main campus. We have on view the show Difference Machines, Technology and Identity in Contemporary Art, which I co-curated along with Paul Vanuz, legendary media artist based here in Buffalo. And this exhibition is a survey of 17 artists who use digital technologies to explore how digital technologies are changing the way that we understand our identities and the way that we understand each other, and impacting the sort of conversation around systemic inequity. So in sort of the context of this exhibition, in light of this exhibition, which is very much about the possibilities of digital art, aesthetically and socially, we wanted to have this conversation this evening about what's going on with digital art right now in 2021. So what is digital art? Christiana Paul, who is a legendary curator of digital art, going back to the 1990s, recently wrote an essay in which she defined digital art as art that explores digital technologies as a medium by making use of its key features, meaning the fact that it's real-time, interactive, participatory, generative, or variable, or by reflecting upon the nature and impact of digital technologies. So in other words, it's not, digital art is not simply art that is made with digital technologies, because at this point, almost every artist practice involves digital technologies at some point. You can imagine, for example, a painter making a painting based off of a digital photograph that they took. Rather, digital art is really about artists who are using digital technologies and exploring the affordances and the limitations of those technologies, whether it's software or networked protocols, or even now the blockchain. I won't get into this too much, but I will say that art and technology has a very long history that goes back for centuries. And specifically in the 20th century, we saw with the emergence of modernism, a real interest in using technology in order to really expand what we think of when we think about art, thinking about art not as something that's this bourgeois luxury commodity, or as something that is static and sits on the wall, but as something that is, that moves, that changes, that can even be interactive. And so oftentimes the sort of godfathers of art and technology are cited as the four people you see here on the screen. So Naum Gabo, Marcel Duchamp, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, and Thomas Wilfred, who all experimented with using new mechanical and electronic technologies in the first few decades of the 20th century. After World War II, art and technology got a big boost from the emergence of kinetic art, or I should say the re-emergence in some sense. There was a kind of a rediscovery of those early pioneers from before the war, leading to new experiments with creating sculptures that moved, which also gave birth to the op art movement. Now, in the 1960s, this kinetic sculpture, sort of came up against this new social condition in which technologies were sort of rapidly proliferating, and there was a lot of excitement in the cultural imagination for things like space exploration or computer technology. And so you have all of this popular culture, for example, so shows like the Jetsons or Star Trek, imagining a not too distant future in which we would live radically different lives. And so in a sense, this art, was sort of a way of imagining a new way of making art that would be suited to this new cultural moment. At the same time, however, there was also, in addition to this techno-utopianism, there was also a techno-dystopianism. There was a huge fear culturally about what technology would mean for society, whether it would make people obsolete because of artificial intelligence, whether it would take over and somehow annihilate the human race. And so these concerns were expressed again in popular culture through movies like Alphaville or 2001: A Space Odyssey. So that's sort of the cultural background for attitudes towards art and technology. And frankly, we're still operating within that context today, right? Thinking about our relationship to technology, whether we are optimistic or sort of dystopian about it, still very much colors how we view artists working with technology today. Now, in the 1960s, art and technology was sort of expressed as a movement that liked to bring together engineers and artists to collaborate. And so we see a lot of that. For example, 9 Evenings was a program that was put on by a new group, Experiments in Art and Technology, that did precisely that, that sort of brought together engineers and artists to collaborate, to push forward both art and engineering. The Los Angeles County Museum of Art also hosted a program that similarly embedded artists within major research corporations in Southern California in order to give them sort of early access to new military industrial technologies, telecommunications technologies, biomedical technologies, and also, to sort of inspire the people working at those corporations to think more creatively. And there's been a lot of research done on this sort of moment in the 1960s. So there was a lot of energy in the 60s, this idea of technology. And I'm just showing you 3 books here on the screen that were published in the early 70s that are fantastic documents of this period. And one of the difficult things about studying the history of art and technology is that so many of the works of art no longer exist anymore. They're no longer in working order. They broke down. So, you really have to rely on these sorts of resources in order to tell these stories. So it's in the context of art and technology that this computer art movement emerges, as it was originally called. So it's in the 1960s when artists begin experimenting with using computers to make works of art. So I'm showing you here on the screen works by 2 of the most iconic early computer artists, Vera Molnar on the left and Manfred Mohr on the right. And as you can see, one of the most common ways to make art with computers back then was to essentially write a software program that would generate an image, and then you would have to output that image essentially in one of 2 ways. You could send it to a plotter printer, which is sort of like a seismograph. It has a pen that's attached to a machine, and the computer controls the machine and moves the pen over a piece of paper, making a drawing. Or you could output it to a cathode ray tube screen and then photograph the screen. So a lot of early computer art actually looks very analog. It's essentially prints, works on paper. So for example, in the Albright-Knox's own collection, we have this very important early computer print called Computer Nude, Studies in Perception 1, made by Leon Harmon and Kenneth Knowlton, who is working at Bell Labs. And so it is, I won't get into the sort of science behind it, but essentially they digitally processed a photo of the dancer Deborah Hay to create this sort of very early experiment in digitizing images, actually digitizing photographs. And that's an example of what we call ASCII art, in the sense that it uses lots of little typographic symbols in order to make up the image. We also have this work in our collection. This was a recent acquisition of the artist Ruth Levitt, who designed, along with her husband, a software program that would allow her to deform and distort images that she had created digitally. So you could imagine her sort of mapping this series of squares and then performing these algorithmic deformations in order to twist them in space like this. The history of computer art, so it begins with these works on paper and that are first exhibited in 1965. So it's the first time that these computer generated images are presented as art, first in Germany. And then 2 months later in New York City, another show happened with a different set of artists called Computer Generated Pictures. And this stuff immediately captures the public imagination. So I'm showing you here an article that was published in Playboy just 2 months after that show in New York City opened, that was sort of a survey of early experiments with using all sorts of machines, analog and digital, to make art. By 1968, we have the first major museum survey of sort of art and specifically digital technology. It's called Cybernetic Serendipity, and it was held at the ICA London and organized by the curator Jazia Reichhardt. And it brought together not only these computer-generated images, but also computer sculptures, computer films, computer music. So it was really an exploration of the possibilities of computation in all sorts of different creative ways. In 1970, the Jewish Museum in New York City presented a show called Software, Information Technology, Its New Meaning for Art. And this was a key exhibition in the way that it brought together the use of computer technologies and contemporary ideas in the field of contemporary art about systems and information and what was then referred to as sort of the open system, the idea of an artwork as an expanded, interactive, mutable thing. And that idea of mutability of the work of art as something that is inherently fungible will become really important in the history of digital art. So if you'd like to learn more about this early moment in the history of digital art, here are 3 books that I would send you to. So the first one written by the curator of Cybernetic Serendipity called The Computer in Art. Another book called Computer Graphics, Computer Art by Herbert Franke, one of the first computer artists. And then Ruth Levitt, whose work is in our collection, actually edited this early book, Artist and Computer, that is an anthology of interviews with some of the leading artists of the day, including, for example, Manfred Mohr and Baron Molnar. More recently, art historians have been focusing more attention on this early moment. And so these are 3 books from the past 10 years that have looked at this moment in the 1960s when computers were, beginning to be explored as a creative medium. By the time you get to the 1980s, well, yeah, and we won't talk too much about the 70s. If you recall what I just mentioned about the techno sort of dystopian in society, the scholar Ann Collins Goodyear has done incredible work showing how essentially in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the oil crisis, and all of these other sort of social problems that were happening that were sort of blamed on technology, also thinking about the environmental movement, there was a great sort of public distrust about technology and the idea that if artists are humanists, they cannot be aligned with technology, that technology is something that is antithetical to the values of art. And so art and technology sort of died off and wasn't given a lot of attention. In fact, Jack Burnham, who was a kinetic sculptor who became a major theorist of systems aesthetics and art and technology, retrospectively wrote an essay called Art and Technology, the Panacea That Failed, writing precisely about this problem of what happened to it in the 70s. In the 1980s, we do see artists working with digital technologies, but they're more coming not from the mainstream contemporary art world. They are people who are experimenting with computers in order to create computer images. And so a lot of this work is commercial in nature. And so it's actually not that dissimilar from what we're seeing right now with NFTs and the emergence of so-called crypto art, which is usually coming from, not exclusively, but has been coming from artists who are outside of the discourse of mainstream contemporary art and who might normally work as commercial artists. So I love these books because they're so 80s. I love the covers, like this one by Cynthia Goodman, Digital Visions, Computers and Art, just sort of fantastic. But there were also artists in mainstream contemporary art who were exploring computers too. The story is not as well known because a lot of these projects were sort of one-offs and have not become the famous or canonical works by those artists. But for example, the artist Sherry Levine, who's a conceptual photographer, was working with digital technologies in the 80s in order to produce images like the Meltdown series here, where she's algorithmically processing photos of famous works of art. Matt Mulliken is another example. He had this exhibition at MoMA in 1989 of sort of stills from a virtual world that he actually created in conjunction with a computer company in Los Angeles. Virtual reality would be a big part of the story of computer art, then sort of already being called digital art in the 1980s and 1990s. So I'm showing you here a photo of a virtual environment called a cave, which was actually on view for about 10 years at Ars Electronica, which I'll talk more about in a second. So virtual reality and artists working with virtual technologies becomes one of the big stories of digital art. Another big story of digital art is hacking, that as more consumer electronics start using digital technologies, more artists start sort of intervening into these technologies. So one of my favorite examples is Artmark's project, the Barbie Liberation Organization, where they hacked into G.I. Joes and Barbies and swapped their voice boxes and then returned them to the shelves in order to sort of invite families with young children to sort of confront the way that these consumer products were actually perpetuating gender stereotypes. Another big story of digital art in the 90s and into the early 2000s is tied to sort of the rising use of digital technologies in understanding the human body. So if you think about the Human Genome Project, that was hugely influential, and a lot of artists were responding to that, also to the invention of sort of new, like very futuristic sounding biomedical technologies. So artists like Eduardo Katz, who worked with genetic cloning, and then Stellark, who, as you can see here, does experiments with his own body in order to make strange biomechanical implants. So these artists are really thinking about the body itself and its relationship to digital technology and sort of imagining this futuristic cyborg kind of existence. Paul Vanus, who's actually my co-curator for Difference Machines, on view now at the museum, started his career working in interactive cinema, but also, now is really known as a bioartist, as somebody who works with the sort of materials and ideas of the biological sciences, and also computation, in order to make art that is very much about the history of medicine or the way that we understand the body. And I'm showing you one of his early projects using DNA analysis here, called Relative Velocity Inscription Device, where he essentially raced literally caused DNA from him and his family members to basically go on a race through the gel medium, which relates to the concept of racial politics, but we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Of course, the big story, though, of digital art in the 90s is going to be the internet. And actually, that story really begins in the 80s, before the World Wide Web. World Wide Web Protocol, is created in 1989, but before the World Wide Web, which is what we all think of today as the internet, there were earlier forms of internets. And so in the 80s, artists were already using certain internet networks in order to collaborate globally, in order to make work, in order to share work. And I'm showing you some early examples of that by Robert Adrian X or Roy Ascott or Sherry Rubinowitz and Kit Galloway, who would basically create stations around the world where people could sort of collaborate and communicate with one another. So early exploration of telecommunications technology as an artistic medium. With the emergence of the web, we see an explosion, relatively speaking, of artists having access to network technologies and to using the internet, not only to share art, there was a lot of that as in these BBS networks, like The Thing, which then migrated to the web, but also to make art. And so I'm showing you here Douglas Davis's The World's First Collaborative Sentence, which was a web-based project that now exists in two versions. There's sort of an archival version, and then there's a version that's still active that allows people all around the world to load this page and then contribute a sentence to it. As sort of described by the title. And I like pointing out that this website was actually bought in 1994 and donated to the Whitney Museum the following year. I'm sorry, it was bought in 1995 and then donated to the Whitney Museum the following year by collectors, just because one of the sort of talking points we're hearing from the sort of discourse around NFTs is that there was never a way to buy and sell digital art before. And that's not true. It has always been possible to buy and sell digital art using simply a certificate of authenticity and regular fiat currency. It's the same way that we, developed a market for conceptual art or for photography, is by creating sort of artificial limited editions and using certificates of authenticity in order to transact those works. So it's always been possible, but it obviously was never done. This buying and selling of digital art was never done at the volume that we're seeing now with the NFT. So in terms of how artists use the internet, so one example is telepresence. That was a really popular idea for a little while that people were working with, that you could actually use the internet in order to control something remotely and create this sort of collapsing of time and space. So Ken Goldberg's Telegarden, for example, allowed people to use the internet to remotely control this robotic arm in order to water or sort of take care of these living plants. And this was an installation that was actually on view for a decade. And obviously we're talking here about the internet, but also cybernetics. They also use the internet in ways that were sort of participatory and also very political. So thinking back to the ethos of hacktivism, there were a lot of projects that realized that the internet could be a really powerful tool for sort of intervening in these new circuits of power. The internet quickly became, or I should say the web quickly became sort of colonized by corporations, and it became a force for the spread of global capitalism. And a lot of artists working around the world, often collaboratively, were very thoughtful in thinking about, what that meant in terms of like the erasure of borders. Is this utopian project, or is it the spread of a sort of neoliberal politics? So I'm showing you here Electronic Disturbance Theater's project FloodNet, where they actually coordinated, it's called a DDoS attack, where they coordinated an attack on the servers of certain governments in order to sort of propagate messages in support of the Zapatistas, this like radical leftist pro-democracy group in Mexico, and to sort of frustrate, the attempts. I'll leave it at that. Probably not entirely legal, let's just say that much. We also see, thinking about, again, like collaboration and using the internet, the creation of these projects that are not only text-based and collaborative, like in Douglas Davis's sentence, but that are richly audio-visual multimedia. So as sort of internet bandwidth increases, as more and more people get modems and get access to increasing amounts of bandwidth, we see the transmission not only of text, but also of images, of sound, of short movies, short videos. And so Shulia Chang's project Brandon was a very, very rich multimedia project that included a sort of virtual space where people could meet, that hosted virtual performances, also images and text, all sort of interactive, choose your own adventure narratives, and then also physical spaces, which were then sort of broadcast virtually. So a sort of very complex networked project bringing together lots of different layers of the real and the virtual. So again, with all this talk now about the metaverse, I just want to point out that artists have been exploring these questions about, real space, quote unquote, real space versus virtual space. And the way in which virtual space actually is becoming its own kind of real space, the way that our experiences online actually are replicating a lot of our experiences offline, whether it's our social networks or our experience of violence, actually, which is what this work is about gender-based violence and transphobia. So the way that sort of carries on into the internet as well. With all of this energy happening around the internet, the art world, was really interested in what artists were doing. And by the late 90s, there was a lot of attention on these early so-called net artists. So for example, Documenta is a major survey of contemporary art that happens every 5 years. It's seen as sort of taking the pulse of what's going on in contemporary art. And in 1997, they hosted a sort of room that showed multiple net art projects. And there was also a website that allowed you to see these projects online. The Whitney Museum, Christiana Paul started their art port in 2001, which was essentially a sort of offshoot of the Whitney's website that would host digital or online exhibitions of online works. And so you see here some of the early exhibitions that they hosted, and all of this is archived now. And then SF MoMA in 2001 presented an exhibition called 010101 Art and Technological Times, which was very much a sort of survey of artists using digital technologies, and also included an online component, a website component where you could go and interact with the works of art. So you see this sort of big rush of institutions to sort of, attempt to think through some of this material. But the relationship was not always an easy one. One of my favorite works actually from this moment is by the team Eva and Franco Mates. So they released a virus called Biennale PY. It's a Python-based virus. Python is a coding language. When they were invited to participate in the Slovenian pavilion of the Venice Biennale, this was their contribution. It was to actually code a relatively harmless virus that still managed to propagate all around the world. They released it on opening night and also showed it on these computers in the exhibition that kept on infecting and disinfecting themselves with this virus. So in my mind, this is sort of a statement about the fact that net art is not something that necessarily wants to be institutionalized. It's not something that wants to exist solely within the confines of the art world, either literally, spatially, architecturally, geographically, or discursively. It's something that wants to mutate and to sort of circulate and exist and be experienced in locations that are very far from what we think of as traditional art spaces. So for the next decade, you have this dot-com boom in this moment in the late 90s, and then the dot-com bubble bursts. And that sort of, again, shifts the attention. The art world goes on and sort of thinks about other things for a little bit, to the point that in 2011, the critic Claire Bishop writes an article called The Digital Divide, Contemporary Art and New Media. And it opens with this sentence, "Whatever happened to digital art?" And she basically says, in the 1990s, we thought there would be this thing called digital art, and whatever happened to it? And why is it that all artists today don't really engage digital technologies? In fact, they engage obsolete technologies. And of course, this led to a huge controversy, because immediately the entire community of people who were still making digital art pointed out that they existed. And essentially, Claire Bishop had said that that wasn't really what she was talking about. She wasn't talking about this parallel art world that had been running for 10 years in the background. She was talking about mainstream contemporary art, and why isn't digital art part of mainstream contemporary art? But of course, okay, yes, but not part of mainstream contemporary art, but very much existing and circulating outside of those confines. So for example, on mailing lists like NetTime, I already talked about BBS, like The Thing, like these earlier networks, and you have more mailing lists where people are exchanging work. They have, the digital art community has its own sort of conferences and festivals, just like the mainstream contemporary art world does. So SIGGRAPH being a big one, sort of like a professional trade fair for people who work with computer graphics. Their own museum. So Ars Electronica, founded in Linz in 1979, now has an enormous museum space where they host exhibitions of digital art. The ZKM Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe in Germany, founded in 1989, also has its own museum space. The NTT Intercommunication Center, so the ICC in Tokyo, founded in the late 90s, also puts on exhibitions of digital art in Japan. And you also have other nonprofits, sort of smaller nonprofits like Furtherfield in London, and HEK, or the House of Electronic Art in Basel, which are organizing exhibitions and creating awards and hosting dialogues, doing really important work that sustains the digital art community. This community also has its own archives, its own canon. So for example, the Art Base at Rhizome, which began as one of those email listservs for artists, digital artists, to sort of exchange ideas and works of art, now is its own nonprofit organization affiliated with the New Museum in New York City. And Rhizome has its own freely accessible database of digital art online that preserves digital art's history. And it even has its own galleries, right? Digital art even has its own galleries. So thinking about Bitforms, founded in 2001, or Transfer Gallery, founded in 2013, and there are many others. In addition to that, we see more social networks with the emergence of Web 2.0 and also the emergence of sort of blogging, a digital art community really finding itself on the internet. And in a way that's very similar to what's happened with NFTs as the community sort of finds itself. You know, back then it was blogs, now it is Discord and Twitter. So the mechanisms are different, but the idea of finding an international community of people is very similar. So after Claire Bishop's article, ironically enough, it seemed like that divide actually started breaking down. So we can point to the exhibition of Corey Archangel, who is very active in the sort of online digital art community. His exhibition at the Whitney Museum in 2011, in my mind, was a sort of opening of the floodgates, where it felt like mainstream contemporary art, again, was very focused on digital art. Some major exhibitions, and I'm just going to tab through these really quickly. Art Post Internet at the UCCA in Beijing attempted to survey this new generation of artists who, rather than exploring the internet as a kind of novelty, instead sort of took the internet as a given and were negotiating the sort of fraught relationship between digital technologies and physical space. We saw lots of installations of sort of immersive digital art. I'm showing you here the work of Ryoji Ikeda, but these started proliferating around the world. Here in Buffalo, we held an exhibition called Screenplay, surveying the impact of digital animation on contemporary art. The ICA in Boston hosted a show called Art in the Age of the Internet, which attempted to sort of give an overview of all of the artists who were thinking about and through the internet over the past 20 or so years. More recently, the De Young Museum hosted a show about artificial intelligence and how artists are responding to that. Right, so you have all of this sort of you know, a flurry of activity focusing on digital art, and now all of a sudden NFTs erupt on the scene. And so just really quickly, you know, the NFT itself is not necessarily a new concept. It was actually first developed by the artist Kevin McCoy with the technologist Anil Dash back in 2014. This work, Quantum, was you know, probably the first, if not, or at least one of the first images ever or works of art ever sold using a blockchain registry. But it's not really until 2017 that we see more people getting interested in the sort of revolutionary ideas behind the Monograph platform, right? The idea that you could use these blockchain-based tokens as sort of surrogates for digital assets that you could then, you know, buy and sell using these unique tokens. So a company called Larva Labs released a series of these little cartoons of 8-bit graphics they called CryptoPunks. And these were the first NFTs on a particular blockchain called Ethereum. And Ethereum has become the sort of standard de facto blockchain for most NFTs, not without controversy, because its ecological imprint is pretty big for now, or environmental impact is pretty big for now. This sort of helped kick off the explosion of what we call digital collectibles. So companies like the NBA realized that they could use NFTs to sell basically any digital asset, including, let's say, a couple second video clip of your favorite player during an NBA game. And just to be clear, you know, the NFTs very rarely, at least on the major platforms, grant any intellectual property rights. You're not actually buying the footage from the NBA, for example. You're merely buying the record on the blockchain that is sort of tied to that footage. So almost like a trading card or something like that. And I think, you know, what made a huge difference, you know, we have these emergence of these platforms of digital collectibles 2017 onwards, but we made a huge difference. And the reason why everything happened this year is that the value of cryptocurrencies, which are these new sort of ersatz currencies that are based off of blockchain technologies, exploded at the end of 2020. And once you have that sort of fourfold increase in value, now you have a lot of people who are looking to buy into the crypto system, who are infusing it with a lot of cash. And once your money is in this ecosystem, there's not currently a whole lot you can do with it yet, except for buy and trade NFTs or conduct illegal business on the black market, but we're not going to talk about that. More and more of these platforms are emerging that are essentially like like Amazon for digital art, these online platforms where artists can list their works for sale and people can go and either buy them outright or participate in auctions to bid on them. I'm showing you here the homepage of one of these nifty gateway from a couple months ago when it was featuring the work of Chantal Martin, who's actually an artist that we showed recently at the museum. And there was this huge explosion of auctions of digital art using NFTs all throughout the spring and the summer. And so I just listed a few of them here, some of the major ones that happened. And very quickly, exhibitions started getting organized. So there was one this summer called Proof of Art that offered a brief history of NFTs. And we're seeing more and more widespread adoption. For example, Pace Gallery, which is a very storied gallery of contemporary art, announced on November 18th that they were launching their own NFT platform for buying and selling NFTs. Now, in terms of the future of digital art, there are some people, including clearly Pace Gallery, who believe that NFTs represent a sort of new frontier for digital art, a new form of legitimization for digital art, a new way to have a digital art market. And there is some question about whether, in fact, NFTs will become not just a tool for buying and selling digital art, but a tool for buying and selling all art, that every work of art now can have its provenance, its sales registered onto the blockchain. So that is a question that remains to be answered. In the meantime, there are many people who are voicing some concerns about the rise of NFTs and blockchain technology. One of these is that the market is not sustainable. So this is by now a very old graphic that I pulled, but as of a couple months ago, you could see that there was this huge explosion in volume early in the year that almost immediately tapered off. So many people now think that we're going into a bear market with NFTs. We also have seen critiques that the sort of egalitarianism that is often marketed as one of the chief advantages of the NFT market, the idea that artists no longer need a gallery, they no longer need a middleman, so they can just sell directly to consumer, which means that they don't necessarily need to have the same kind of pedigree, the expensive MFA program, et cetera, in order to create a career for themselves, might not totally be true, or might not be as true as it's supposed to be. So the artist Kimberly Parker pulled some data back in April and saw that while we have these astronomical sales, like the Beeple sale for $69 million, that in fact, most artists were selling, work for under 200. So here, a third of the artists are selling NFTs for $100 or less. And more studies have shown that to sort of be the case, that, the high end of the market is very, very, very high, but the vast majority of the market is still pretty limited in terms of price per transaction. There have also been a lot of concerns about the ecological cost of blockchain, and I'm not going to get into that and litigate it, but I just will say that there is a lot of concern. The blockchain, especially what are called proof of work blockchains like Ethereum currently is, are very energy, they're like resource intensive by design. They work by asking computers to solve very difficult problems that make the computers take a long time and eat up a lot of energy. And so there's a lot of debate about what is the most accurate and fair way to calculate that energy consumption. And I'm not going to get into it. I will just say that there is certainly some ecological cost, and that some blockchains have a higher ecological cost than others. And that Ethereum for a while, it has supposedly been ready to transition to using a different consensus algorithm called proof of stake that would make it less resource intensive, but that has not yet come to fruition, so we're waiting to see. Now, despite all of this energy about blockchain, thinking about the NFT, I do just want to point out that artists have been working with blockchain for a long time. And so just in the next minute or two, and then I'll open up for some questions if anybody has any, I will just point out that, the artists like Laturbo Avedon, for example, have been really interested in blockchain for almost a decade now. So Laturbo had an exhibition at a solo show at Transfer Gallery back in 2013. of these prints of sort of digital sculptures that they made. And they only sold using Bitcoin. You could only buy these with Bitcoin. And so Laturbo is actually an avatar artist. And so Laturbo has been thinking about the metaverse for a very long time. The metaverse basically just meaning virtual reality, kind of. And so I hope that in the next stage of the evolution of the conversation around NFTs, we can look to the artists who have been in this space for a long time and thinking about the philosophical and aesthetic sort of repercussions of these technologies and sort of amplify the work that they're doing. Harm van den Dorpel is another sort of early adopter. He was actually the very first artist to sell a work to a museum using an NFT. So he made an edition of this work called Event Listeners. And it's a generative work. I'm playing a screen recording of the live software program running for you right now. So he editioned this, there were 100 editions and the museum bought 20 of them. And so I just like to point out that there are many different ways to financialize digital art. Right now, there's a lot of conversation, or there's a lot of excitement and energy in the NFT movement around unique NFTs called one-of-ones. But in fact, there's nothing saying that you can't edition a work and have, 100 identical NFTs, although it sort of defeats the purpose of the NFT, which is about creating a unique record. Mitchell F. Chan is one of the sort of early generation of conceptual artists working with blockchain technologies to think about what it means to create fully immaterial works of art that live on the blockchain. Rhea Myers is another one who very early on was experimenting with the way in which using network technologies to create art sort of has very interesting knock-on implications or repercussions about the nature of art itself. And there was a major exhibition curated by Simon Denny, along with Harm van den Dorpel and a group of other people, that happened at the Schinkel Pavilion in Berlin in 2018 that surveyed some of these sort of early forays into working with blockchain. In the wake of the sort of NFT explosion, there, I think, were some really interesting developments that I want to amplify. I know that we focus a lot on the auctions, and especially in the contemporary art world, we focus a lot on, the aesthetics of the digital collectibles, but I sort of think that that's missing the point. That's not the conversation I think we need to be having necessarily. I understand it, and we should always be thinking about aesthetics, but in fact, there are people in the space who are doing really interesting work, for example, questioning the values of how we transact around not only digital art, but all works of art, thinking about all contemporary art markets and thinking about what the NFT market means for digital artists and for digital art, how we value digital art now and how that has changed. And so one early sort of response to this moment to work through some of these questions was an exhibition, a group show called Pieces of Me that was co-organized by the galleries Transfer Gallery and Left Gallery. And it included works by artists who were thinking about, these issues of sort of like this hyper-capitalistic market in which artists are becoming even more so personal brands and, minting these NFTs and making a lot of money based off of their ability to manipulate these social networks. So Maura Shanala-Yari, who's actually an artist who is in the Difference Machines exhibition at the Albright-Knox right now, created this work, Talisman for the Possession of the NFT, that includes her own sort of runic inscriptions to give somebody good luck. Feral File is a platform or sort of an online gallery that was launched earlier this year by the artist Casey Reyes, who's been a digital artist for decades, a big leader in the space, offering online-only exhibitions of file-based art. Unlike a lot of NFT platforms where essentially it's sort of like Amazon, where it's a free-for-all, where anybody can list anything and there's no curation or creation of context, Feral File does actually have thematic group shows organized by guest curators that focus on a particular topic and bring together a group of artists in pretty intelligent ways. So the current exhibition right now is called Graph, and it was organized by Casey himself. Art Blocks is a new, everything is new this year in a way, but is a platform for making generative art NFTs. So the way that Art Blocks works is that when you buy the work, then the work is actually minted onto the blockchain. And it's in the process of minting it on the blockchain that the work is sort of generated and acquires its properties. And sometimes those works actually continue to mutate and evolve. They're sort of iterative, responding to different kinds of external inputs. So I'm showing you here actually a project that Casey Reyes did with art blocks. And I'm just going to show you a video. Now, this is this whole series is called Century, and it's essentially his, as he says, his homage to the history of geometric abstraction, and particularly the works of Ellsworth Kelly. And so these are some of the different tokens in this series, so the different works of art in the series. And here's my video of one of these works. So live, real time, it continues to iterate and evolve. Here's just my video of it evolving. And now I just, want to make clear that I don't own this work, right? One of the beautiful things about NFTs is that it actually allows the work to be freely accessible on the internet. Anybody can watch it and see it. You can go to some place called the IPFS, Interplanetary File System, where a lot of the actual artwork is stored. Artwork is not usually stored on chain, although Art Blocks is kind of stored on chain. It's complicated, but anybody can sort of see it and download it. In very few cases, you get maybe some extra privileges or rights, or you unlock a higher resolution file if you actually buy it, but that's not universally the case. So that's kind of great that it allows artists to monetize their work while still having the work be publicly accessible, although of course museums also provide the same service. So I just want to end with this slide of a work by Dred Scott, who is a conceptual artist, a very activist artist who's been making work for decades, especially about the legacy of racism and the history of systemic inequality in this country. So Dred made this work called White Male for Sale and auctioned it as an NFT earlier this fall. And as he says, he was prompted to make this NFT because he thought the word fungible was so interesting, because it actually ties to the history of slavery and to slave auctions. That essentially, as he says, people are inherently non-fungible, but one of the ways that slavery developed was by creating these ledgers that allowed enslaved people to be recorded as fungible property, that there were literally these sort of equations that were made. Well, this one man is worth 5 of these women. And so that sort of resonated for him. And so he made this work where he is showing a white man standing on an auction block being auctioned. And so it's a 1-minute looping video, and somebody bought the NFT of this video for $32,000. And so I just want to end there to say that I really hope that in the next stage of the evolution of NFTs and digital art, we can have more conversations around what the NFT is, how it works, and even beyond that, what our values are in this space. So I mentioned branding, for example, the way in which artists now are having to auction themselves off. What kind of labor are they performing? Is it similar to or different from the contemporary art market that we already had? And what kind of art world do we want to imagine in the future? And are NFTs going to be a way for us to bring that future into existence? And will they help us on that journey as they are, or do we need to sort of try to imagine them in new ways, create different kinds of platforms, different kinds of contracts? So essentially, all of this is going to require a lot of conversation, and we're not going to solve any of it right now, but I look forward to the conversation to come. So before I jump into the questions, I just want to quickly say that I'm very grateful to our exhibition sponsors for making this program possible this evening. The generosity of Aileron Group, Mr. Charles E. Ballback, and Mr. and Mrs. Charles W. Banta. So thank you very much for bringing us all together tonight. Okay, so Rhea Myers herself is in the chat. I can see the Q&A here. So if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to drop them in. So Rhea asked a question that I think is a really interesting one. How does 60s anti-militarism expressed against computer artists compare to contemporary anti-capitalism expressed against NFT art? So Rhea's asking a question that, the artist Ann Spalter actually was one of the first people, I think, to hit upon, that there is a kind of echoing that is happening with the kind of very profound and almost violent response against computer art in the 1960s. and the kind of violent response that people are having against NFTs right now. And I think it's worth considering the way in which artists become kind of, what's the word I want to say here? They become sort of stand-ins. They become scapegoats for people's energy, for people's animus towards things that are much bigger than the art world. And I don't think that's entirely fair to put all of that on artists. At the same time, I think artists should be cognizant of the way in which, you know, they're using these technologies that are not simply neutral, right? So one of the common sort of defenses is, well, the computer is just a neutral tool, right? As an artist, I'm just using it the same way that I would use a paintbrush. But of course, all tools, including paintbrushes, have particular histories. They emerge from particular contexts. They're tied to particular economic or political, as well as aesthetic and social systems. So I think it is worth thinking through all of that, which is my sort of non-answer. But I will say I think it's important to think about where is the sort of energy coming from? What is it that people are really trying to protest? And what parts of that you know, are worth listening to, right? So I think that it's often been sort of characterized that all of the responses to NFTs right now are sort of knee-jerk responses, and a lot of it might just be people being technophobic. And I'm sure that those are part of the responses, and I'm not necessarily interested in those responses. I don't think they're productive. You're not going to have a productive conversation. But I think there are some responses that are thinking about, well, what is this technology? What is its ecological impact? What is its political impact? What is the ideology here? Where did this technology emerge from? And I think those are really fair questions that anyone using any medium should have to answer, whether it's a technological medium or another kind of medium. I will also say that the response towards computers in the 1960s was very much about the computer as a medium and what it meant for creativity. And what we're seeing right now is that that's actually not what a lot of people are talking about. That is a question or a critique that people had of sort of machine learning generated art, which often very self-consciously explores those questions in a really interesting way. But I think most of the critique now that is leveled at the emergence of NFTs has a lot more to do with the market, not the art itself. Or yeah, not the idea of using, it's not like, how dare you use technology to make art? It's more like, what are the sort of, you know, what are the consequences of this technology in sort of many ways, right? Ecological, social, et cetera. And also, you know, what is this market that has been created and what are its values? And I think that that is a very fair conversation to have. Actually, it's a conversation we were just having in the contemporary art world about the contemporary art market. If you think about all of the ink that's been spilled about the problem of free ports or the sort of exploitation of artist labor, it's like we were having that conversation in that space, and now I think we should be carrying it through to this NFT space as well. Okay, another question came in from Chris Coleman. How far along is the Albright-Knox in considering the collecting of artworks which are sold as NFTs? How are they thinking about conservation? So I will say that it hasn't come up. I think we have no plans to acquire or produce any NFTs in the near future. As I was just advocating for, I think everybody needs to sort of move a little more slowly and thinking about, you know, what is the best way forward right now, and what are the real opportunities here, and what are the potential limitations or costs that we can sort of budget into our expectations from the outset. I would say that, you know, I've said all along that for an institution, an NFT is neither necessary nor sufficient for acquiring an associated asset. So unless you're talking about something that is truly on chain, that is truly exists, like where the work of art itself exists in the interaction with the blockchain, which is not the majority of NFTs. It is the case of NFTs on art blocks, for example, minted on art blocks, but not for the majority of NFTs. So in the cases in which the NFT is simply being used to transact the associated asset, I would say that, you know, we're not going to not want the asset because it is an NFT, but we're also not going to want the asset because it is tied to an NFT. that good art is good art, and we're not particularly going to be concerned about how it's supposed to be bought and sold. I will say that in that instance, I think the NFT itself, and this is heretical for people that are in the sort of NFT community, you can't really separate the two. But for us, the NFT then, again, I'm not talking about on-chain works, but for other works, the NFT becomes a kind of a certificate of authenticity that would get handled by museum registrars and added to the sort of documentation around the work of art. What we would really accession into the collection is not so much the NFT itself, it would be the associated JPEG file or the associated MPEG file or the associated piece of generative software. And that poses interesting conservation questions, but we've been acquiring digital art for decades. You know, we have, I pulled it from this presentation, but we have, you know, a work by John F. Simon Jr. that we acquired in 2005, 15 years ago. So, you know, these are problems that the field of time-based media art conservation and digital art conservation has been dealing with now since the 1990s. And we have protocols in place, things like intake questionnaires, iteration reports, long-term storage plans, thinking about migrating, you know, servers every 7 years or doing checksums for bit rot and things like that. Like we have mechanisms in place to conserve digital art. Now, when it comes to conserving blockchain-based digital art, that is an enormous problem that everyone in the NFT space is going to have to sort of work, I think, with institutional curators, or at least experienced digital art curators and conservators, to try to figure out how to solve that problem. Because of course, blockchains are not really forever. Blockchains have gone out of service, let's say. And also, just because something is stored on the blockchain doesn't mean that it's actually conserved. There's a difference between storing a digital work of art and conserving it. Thinking about, for example, the creation of documentation, those iteration reports I mentioned, capturing the context of that work and the artist's intent. All of that is sort of much larger than just, oh, where do you store this digital file? And especially since blockchains usually don't store the digital file, I don't see them as sort of a silver bullet for answering that question. That was a very long-winded answer to your question, Chris Coleman. I hope that helps. I think that ultimately the takeaway is that there is good art and interesting art being made in every art world, in every art movement, in every place, in every medium, and it's always the job of curators to find those good projects and highlight them. Okay, so 2 more quick questions. And if people need to run, I know they need to run, but I'm happy to just answer these really quickly. So Mark Von Arx asked, can you comment on the value of smart contracts and allowing the artist to participate in future sales of their NFTs or even original IRL artwork? Yes, so the secondary or resale rights has been one of the huge selling points of NFTs. The idea that basically you can encode a smart contract on the NFT that with the NFT that makes it so that when the work is sold in the future, it would sort of automatically trigger resale rights that would you know, go back to the artist. So for example, if I sell the work for $100, but my NFT has a piece of code that says that I have to kick back 10% of that to the artist, then that automatically gets deducted from my profits and gets sent over to the artist blockchain wallet. Resale rights are something that people in the contemporary art world have been fighting for since the 1960s. Congress has been asked multiple times to pass legislation that would sort of federally enforce resale rights. Of course, it's very tricky to do that because how are you going to know that somebody sold your work on the secondary market if it was a private sale? If they didn't, like if you find out about it and they didn't give you your appropriate cut, then you're going to have to hire lawyers, which can be very expensive, in order to go and get that cut from them. You have to basically sue them for breaching contract. So blockchain, if it can truly automate these automatic secondary, secondary market royalties, would be truly incredible. The problem is that right now, there is not yet, and maybe somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least as of a few months ago, there wasn't really a kind of smart contract that would work across all platforms and when you bridge an NFT and bring it to another chain across all chains. And of course, there's always another easy way to get around triggering that, which is to simply conduct your transaction offline. I'm very hopeful. I think it's one of the biggest selling points of NFTs. But at the end of the day, we're also talking about a smart contract, not a legal contract. And this is another reason why NFTs are neither necessary nor sufficient for museums to acquire works of art, is that we need to know that we're actually acquiring the work of art, maybe not the copyright to the IP, because museums never acquire that, but or at least generally don't acquire that. But we need to know we're actually acquiring the asset, and most smart contracts actually, or most, let's say the legal terms and conditions of the NFT platforms actually don't give you ownership over the asset. It just gives you ownership over the NFT. And the artist actually retains control and ownership over the associated asset, which in a way is great for the artist because it allows them to actually retain their work while also monetizing it. So they get to sort of double dip. I don't know where I was going with this smart contracts. So the smart contracts. So these smart contracts, we don't know yet. They haven't been, as far as I know, still, this is a couple months ago, but I don't think they've been tested in a court of law yet. So we actually don't know if smart contracts are legally enforceable. The idea is that technologically they're automatically self-enforcing, but are they actually legal? Nobody really knows yet. And so that's why a museum would still want a traditional contract written up by a lawyer, like, a traditional deed, an actual certificate of authenticity, to know that when we're acquiring a work of art, we're actually acquiring the work of art and not just the NFT of it on the blockchain. Okay, and then Maria Scully asks a question: what are you thinking about the disruption of the current state of affairs by AI? So artificial intelligence, which, a lot of artists who work with artificial intelligence prefer the term machine learning, because artificial intelligence is really overselling what machine learning is. It makes it sound like something sort of much more powerful than it is. So machine learning or artificial intelligence has potential huge impact on the near future, especially when coupled with robotics. We don't, I'm not necessarily going to speculate on that. That's a little like outside of my wheelhouse. I will just say that I think there are a lot of artists who are exploring artificial intelligence, machine learning in really interesting ways. I just did a great studio visit with the artist Alexander Rebin, who's been thinking about machine learning for a while. A lot of NFTs, what we are seeing is a lot of NFTs use machine learning in order to generate sort of a series of related works. So you'll feed, a training, you sort of train, you feed a data set into your GAN, and then, it sort of trains it, and then you give it a prompt, and then it spits things out, et cetera. I'm oversimplifying. But you can use style GANs to create to like automatically generate a series of works, right? And there's a lot of debate right now about the aesthetic value of the strategy. In some ways it's related, like all generative art, to the history of chance in modern art. Artists have been playing with automation and with indeterminacy, for 150 years now, if not longer. But the end result is sort of that a lot of these projects look the same. And so I'm more interested in people who are sort of exploring either the politics of these training sets. So for example, the artist Stephanie Dinkins in the exhibition Difference Machines has a work where she sort of is thinking about the way that artificial intelligence is being trained, basically using the memories, ideas, expectations, faces of the people who make the technology, which means basically white cishet men. And so what does it mean that our future technologies are being made in the image of a particular, subset of people, of the population? What does that mean for everybody else? And how might that contribute to systemic forms of inequality? So I'm interested in that. Or if somebody like Alexander Rebin, who sort of turns the question on its head and who focuses more on the very physical way that AI is about to shape our lives, that it won't just be something that's purely computational and abstract. It'll be something that we really experience in a very concrete kind of way. So I encourage you guys to look into his practice if you are curious more about that. I'm not seeing any other questions come in. So, oh wait, I'm sorry, I did see one more from Hene. So is there a website where you can go to see the market of NFTs? So the one that I have used a lot is called cryptoart.io. But there are others that I'm blanking out on right now, but you could really honestly just, crypto art pulse, I think, is another one. But you could almost just Google, and there's a lot of databases that have aggregated that information, because one of the advantages of NFTs is that all of the transactions are public. They might be between anonymous wallets, but everything happens out in the open. So, so unlike the traditional art market, where, for example, you know, a sale may happen privately and there's no record of it, and so you don't know that particular artist's historical auction record. Everything is on the blockchain, and so it's very easy to just write code to scrape all of that data and then you know, get a picture of what the market is. Now, unfortunately, one of the problems is that because the wallets are anonymous, you can have a lot of manipulation of the market. So for example, if I can own 2 separate blockchain wallets, and I can send the work back and forth between them, you know, making it look like this particular NFT has a sales history of having sold for X dollars, when really I was just transferring it back and forth between myself. So it also opens up a lot of market manipulation as well. So a lot of the statistics, for example, may not be, you know, in some sense they're more transparent, but in other senses they actually might be more sort of obfuscating the reality. So, okay, so Chris Coleman asks if the AK will share this recording. It was such a great overview of digital art history. Thank you very much, Chris Coleman. It was far too much to cover in the time I had allotted, and I left so much out, and I'm sorry that I had left out everyone's favorite artist, I am sure, but I believe that we will have a recording of this available and we'll circulate it to participants. If anybody has any further questions, please, you can find me on social media. You can reach out through the Albright-Knox, and I very much look forward to continuing this conversation about the future of digital art and also the history of digital art, which has to help shape its future in the months or years to come. And again, if you are able to get to Buffalo, our survey of the last 30 years of one really important story in contemporary digital art since the 1990s, Difference Machines, is on view through January 16th. So we hope we will see you in Buffalo. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us this evening, and have a great night.